I still remember the sound that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. It was early morning when I woke up to the smell of smoke. At first, I thought it was just the fire in the stove, but then I heard shouting outside. By the time I ran to the window, the sky was already glowing orange. I rushed outside barefoot into the cold dirt yard. The barn was on fire, flames tearing through the roof, sparks flying into the dark sky. The neighbors were already there, shouting, forming a line with buckets of water. I joined them, but deep down I knew we were too late. The fire had been burning for too long. Hours passed like minutes. When the roof finally collapsed with a deafening crack, I felt my knees give out. The barn was gone. Our grain, our tools, the work of 2 years, gone with it. I stood there covered in soot, my hands black, my face wet with sweat and tears, and I could not move. That night, I sat alone outside, staring at the smoking ruins. The air was cold, but I didn't feel it. The silence after the fire was louder than the fire itself. Everything I had worked for, everything I thought was safe, had vanished in a single morning. But then I saw the first light of dawn. The sky turned pale blue, the birds started singing, and something inside me shifted. I realized that if I could lose everything in one day, I could build it all again. The fire had taken my barn, my grain, my tools, but it had not taken me. Today, many years later, when I look at the new barn standing tall on that same spot, I remember that morning. I remember the smell of smoke, the sound of the roof collapsing, the weight of despair. But I also remember the sunrise. And it reminds me every day that no matter what you lose, as long as you are alive, you can start over. That night, I could not sleep. The house was too quiet, as if even the walls were mourning what we had lost. I sat outside on the porch, the stool creaking under my weight, staring at the blackened remains of the barn. The smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air, mixing with the cold night wind. The stars were bright, almost cruelly beautiful, as if mocking the darkness inside me. The ground was still warm from the fire, steam rising in thin white lines from the ashes. Every time the wind blew, a few glowing embers lit up like tiny ghosts, reminding me of the work that had burned away. I thought of every nail I had hammered, every seed I had planted, every hour I had spent building that barn with my own hands. All of it was gone in a single morning. I felt the weight of years pressing down on me. My hands were rough and black from soot, my clothes stiff from sweat and ash, but I did not move. It felt as if I had turned into one of those burnt beams, silent, broken, and useless. Hours passed, but I stayed there, my eyes fixed on the ruins, until the night began to fade. When the first pale light appeared on the horizon, it struck the smoke and made it glow faintly, like silver threads weaving through the air. I realized that even in this destruction, there was something strangely beautiful. The night had taken everything from me, but the morning was still here. And somehow, that was enough to make me stand up and take my first step back toward life. When the sun finally rose, it lit up every scar left by the fire. The blackened beams, the collapsed roof, the scattered tools that were now nothing but twisted metal. All of it stood before me, silent witnesses of what had happened. The air was sharp and cold, but it carried the smell of fresh morning mixed with the bitter smoke, and for some reason that smell made me breathe deeper. I walked slowly across the yard, stepping carefully between the ashes. Every crunch under my boots felt like walking over pieces of my past. My hands brushed against the charred wood, and black soot stuck to my skin, leaving marks that no amount of water could wash away that day. I stood in the middle of the ruins for a long time, feeling the weight of the silence. Then I straightened my back and looked toward the horizon. The sky was bright now, a clear pale blue, and a single bird flew across it. Something in that simple moment reminded me that life was still moving forward, with or without me. I knew rebuilding would take months, maybe years, but at that moment I understood that I could not let this be the end. The fire had taken everything I owned, but it had also burned away my fear of starting over. I left the ruins, went back into the house, and began to plan. I found a piece of paper, a pencil, and started drawing the first lines of what would become the new barn. My hands were still shaking, but they were no longer weak. That morning, as the sun climbed higher, I felt something inside me shift. The loss was still heavy, but it was no longer crushing me. It had become fuel. The fire outside had created a fire inside, and that fire was telling me to build, to work, to make something even stronger than before. The next few days felt endless. Every morning I woke up before the sun and stepped outside to face the blackened yard. At first, I only stood there, staring, as if waiting for something to change on its own. But then I began to work. I picked up the burnt beams one by one, my hands blistered from the rough wood, my back aching. Pile by pile, I cleared the ruins until there was nothing left but an empty patch of ground and a heap of ashes at the edge of the yard. Each piece I carried away felt like I was taking a piece of my grief and setting it aside. The work was heavy, slow, and lonely, but with every cleared space, I felt the weight inside my chest grow lighter. The neighbors stopped by sometimes, bringing me bread or offering a few kind words, but most of the time it was just me, the wind, and the creaking sound of wood being dragged away. By the end of the week, the ground was clean, the smoke was gone, and for the first time I could stand there without feeling crushed. The emptiness no longer looked like a wound. It looked like a place waiting for something new. The day I put the first new post into the ground was the day I truly started breathing again. The wood was fresh, smelling of resin, smooth under my hands. I dug the hole with care, set the post straight, and hammered the first nail. The sound echoed across the yard, sharp and alive. With each strike, I felt my heart beating stronger. The barn would not be rebuilt in a day or a week, but this was the first step towards something better. My hands were sore, my shirt damp with sweat, but I kept going until the sun started to set. When I finally stood back and looked at the single post standing in the middle of the empty yard, it looked small and lonely, but it was there. It was proof that the fire had not beaten me. I sat on the porch that evening, staring at it until the stars came out, feeling something I had not felt since the fire, pride. That summer became a season of work. Day after day, I cut wood, measured beams, hammered nails, and shaped every piece with my own hands. My palms became hard as stone, my back sore, but my spirit was alive again. The yard was filled with the sound of tools, the smell of fresh-cut wood, and sometimes even laughter when neighbors came to help. Every evening, I would sit on the porch, watching the skeleton of the new barn rise against the setting sun. It grew slowly, board by board, but with each passing day it began to look more like a place where life could happen again. I could almost hear the sound of grain sacks being stacked, animals moving around, tools clinking, sounds that had been lost in the fire but were now waiting to return. By the end of the summer, the frame was standing tall, the roof half done, and my heart felt lighter than it had in months. The loss was still part of me, but it no longer controlled me. I was building not just a barn, I was building myself back, piece by piece, nail by nail. The day the roof was finished, the whole yard smelled of fresh wood and resin. I climbed the ladder slowly, my legs trembling not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. When I hammered the last nail into the last plank, I stopped and just stood there on top, looking out at the fields and the distant tree line. The new barn stood tall and proud, its clean wood shining in the sunlight. For a moment I forgot about the fire, the smoke, the ashes. All I could see was what I had built with my own hands. My shirt was soaked, my palms raw, but I had never felt stronger. That evening, I didn't sit on the porch like before. Instead, I sat inside the barn, leaning against the wall, breathing in the smell of new wood. The walls around me were empty, but they no longer felt hollow. They felt full of promise. Weeks later, when the first sacks of grain were carried into the barn, I stood by the door and watched carefully as each one was stacked inside. The sound of grain shifting inside the sacks was like music. It was proof that life had not stopped, that the cycle of work and reward was still turning. The barn that had once been nothing but ashes was now holding the first fruits of a new season. I walked between the rows of sacks, running my hands over the rough fabric, feeling the weight of them. And for the first time since the fire, I allowed myself to smile. That night, when the wind blew outside, it no longer sounded like loss. It sounded like a song of something that had survived. Months passed, the seasons changed, and the barn became part of the yard again, as if it had always been there. But every time I stepped outside and saw it standing tall against the sky, I felt the same quiet victory inside me. One evening, I sat on the same stool where I had once stared at the smoking ruins. The sun was setting, painting the barn in gold. I looked at it and realized that the fire had not been the end. It had been the beginning. I had lost everything once, but now I had something even stronger. The porch was quiet, the air was cool, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. Months passed, the seasons changed, and the barn became part of the yard again, as if it had always been there. But every time I stepped outside and saw it standing tall against the sky, I felt the same quiet victory inside me. One evening, I sat on the same stool where I had once stared at the smoking ruins. The sun was setting, painting the barn in gold. I looked at it and realized that the fire had not been the end. It had been the beginning. I had lost everything once, but now I had something even stronger. The porch was quiet, the air was cool, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. When the barn was finally filled and ready for the season, I invited the neighbors who had helped me on that terrible morning. They stood in the yard with quiet smiles, looking at the new building, and for a while no one spoke. The memory of the fire was still there in all of us, but standing in front of what had risen from the ashes felt like a kind of celebration. We shared bread and tea on the porch, the same porch where I had once sat alone in the dark. The night was warm, and the stars above looked gentler than before. I listened to the laughter around me and realized that the barn wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who had stood by me through those months. The first winter after the fire was quiet, but this time it didn't scare me. I woke up early each morning, opened the barn doors, and saw the grain safe inside, protected from the snow and the wind. The sound of the wood creaking in the cold made me smile instead of flinch. One night, during the heaviest snowfall of the year, I stepped outside and looked at the barn covered in a perfect layer of white. The air was silent, the stars shining, and I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I realized that the fire had burned away my fear, my doubt, and even some of my pride. What was left was only the will to keep going, and the peace that comes after a long fight. I turned back toward the house, the light from the window glowing warmly, and for the first time since that day, I felt completely whole again. The first winter after the fire came slowly, as if giving me time to prepare for it. By the time the first snow began to fall, the barn was full and strong, its new wood glowing against the pale sky. Each morning I would wake up early, open the doors, and breathe in the smell of grain, hay, and fresh wood. The cold air would bite my face, but instead of sadness, it brought me calm. The sound of the barn doors creaking no longer reminded me of the night of the fire. Now it sounded like a heartbeat, steady and alive. When the heaviest snowfall of the year arrived, the entire yard turned into a world of white. The roof of the barn was blanketed in snow, the fences were half buried, and the path to the house was a narrow line carved through the drifts. That evening I lit the stove, made tea, and sat by the window, watching the snowflakes dance in the orange glow of the lantern outside. At some point, I stood up, put on my coat, and stepped into the night. The cold was sharp, but the silence was perfect. My boots sank deep into the snow as I walked across the yard. The barn stood tall, its roof heavy with snow, looking almost like a sleeping giant guarding everything inside. I brushed the snow off the door and stepped inside. It was warm, quiet, and filled with the faint smell of grain. I stood there for a long time, running my hand over the wooden wall, feeling the smooth surface under my fingers. I thought about the night I had lost it all, the fire, the smoke, the screaming wind, and then looked around at what now stood in its place. I sat down on a wooden crate in the middle of the barn and closed my eyes. The silence was so deep I could hear my own breath. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not just relief, not just pride, but peace. It was the kind of peace that comes only after you have walked through fire, carried the weight of loss, and built something new with your own hands. When I stepped outside again, the snow had stopped. The sky was clear and full of stars. The moonlight made the barn shine softly, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the cold air fill my lungs. I looked back toward the house, saw the warm light glowing in the window, and felt the quietest, deepest victory of my life. I had lost everything once, but that night, standing in the snow, I understood that what I had gained was far greater. The barn was more than just wood and nails now. It was proof that no fire, no storm, no darkness could take away my will to begin again.